a story like this for Donald Trump is the people around him, right? Like 20 years ago, if everything was the same, you would not have, however, 100 plus Congress people and half a dozen senators vote to decertify the election on January 6th. But the Republican Party has changed, and there may have been people in the White House a year ago who were trying to put the brakes on what Trump was doing. Don't bring out the military to deal with Black Lives Matter. Milley, your reporting suggests that he thought there was, at the very least, some attempt at a coup, for lack of a better word. It's conceivable to me that 10 years from now, when Marjorie Taylor Greene is president, the people who surround her will have also, evolved or devolved, however your perspective is on that, and they won't be tapping the brakes. Did you see a difference between the sort of, and there was a lot of people who came through the White House in the first 3 years, as well, I guess, ultimately in the fourth, but was there a difference in the sets of administrative personnel that had some people been there in the last year versus the first years, or vice versa, that maybe the outcomes of these situations would have been different?
I also love that question because it goes right to the theme that connects the two books, Stable Genius, our first book, our first attempt to understand the Trump presidency, and then I Alone Can Fix It, that final devastating and chaotic year. The first sort of chunk of the Trump presidency, those first 2.5 to 3 years, the president had some pretty serious people around him. I mean, not an A++ team in every regard, because there were a lot of people pretty anxious in the Republican Party about signing on with Donald Trump based on watching his campaign. So you didn't have a lot of Bush appointees going, oh yeah, I want to help this guy out. But you had some significant serious adults, people like Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State, bad reviews for being a Secretary of State from employees who felt he was a little aloof, but a really serious guy who ran a Fortune 100 company. General Mattis, Mad Dog Mattis, a guy with a real student of history, a ton of experience in the field and also in management. You had John Kelly, a general who had spent so much time in Southcom, understood the border, understood Congress as a previous job that he had interacting with Congress and the Defense Department. So these were serious people. He fired all of them. He fired almost everyone in the first zone. He changed and went through so many chiefs of staff and defense secretaries and Homeland Security secretaries. It was hard to keep track as a reporter at times. And what he was able to do was grind through all those people who were holding him back. He had fewer people in the final year holding him back and giving him advice. But worse than that, he'd become emboldened. He had realized he emerged unscathed from the Mueller report. He'd survived impeachment. He'd been engaged in things that would normally land, you and me in jail. We would be indicted at least. And he skated through that. So that made him feel like he was the best, political strategist. He was the best arbiter of how to move forward on a policy. The combination was genuinely lethal. A person who had less guardrails around him and was convinced of his superiority in all decision making. And it meant he shut out a lot of smart people and shut out people like Robert Redfield, who believed that thousands of people died because he couldn't get Donald Trump to wear a mask. He shut out Bill Barr, who we all thought was, sort of a henchman essentially to get Trump reelected by hook or by crook, and was actually trying to get him to recognize that you can't attack civil rights protesters in American cities.
In other words, like I don't have that big of a hook to get him reelected. I mean, do you have a sense when you mentioned Redfield with his lamentation about the mask? Do you have a sense of like what went on with things like the PPE, the inability to sort of like, you know, all the weird contracts that were issued, and the idea of like we're going to slow the roll on any type of national testing. I mean, my understanding is that like at one point they were going to send out masks through the post office, and that there was going to be more of like a national testing regime. Like, who was that? Donald Trump's idea, and people just sort of said, okay. Where did that all come from?
So my understanding about this period is a little more complicated because remember, at first, Donald Trump is trying to deny there is any problem, and that stretches pretty far from, you know, the first case being found in the third week of January in the United States until the second week of March. He's still in kind of a, oh, don't worry about this. During that time, but there's another factor that's not helping the United States response, and that is that the CDC's testing plan, remember, they don't do national testing, they create a model for national testing. Their model doesn't work so great. There was nothing unusual about the fact that the CDC launched into creating sort of the banner example for all the other labs to use. It's just that it was fraught with peril because of earlier mistakes in the beginning of formulating the testing. The CDC doesn't do national testing. Labs, hospitals, they mimic the CDC's tests and they launch. But then there was a third thing that was making for big problems, and that was Donald Trump, in every opportunity, tried to reduce the chance of Americans learning how many people were infected. So, for example, when his chief of staff, and then at that time Mick Mulvaney, before he fired him, and at that time his Deputy Secretary of State and his Health and Human Services Secretary, Azar, they come to him and say, you know, Mr. President, Wuhan has been shuttered by the Chinese government. There is basically a gate around this province because of the outbreak of this mysterious pneumonia, and we have got to get American diplomats out of the city, out of the province, and back to America. The president initially says, absolutely not. That's just going to raise our numbers. If any of those people are sick, that's going to count towards a higher number of people with the virus. Now, keep in mind, these are diplomats who are in China to serve the U.S. public, to serve the U.S. government. And Trump's reaction is, well, I don't know why they're in China, but they shouldn't have gone there in the first place. So again, every chance he has, he wants to block the realization or the compilation of real data on how many Americans have this infection.
Who would you say, as you look over the course of, you know, and maybe there's two different answers, you know, depending on the era, who is the biggest enabler of Trump?
You know, sadly, it is his. I didn't even have to think about it. It's his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, who is extremely loyal to Donald Trump and described by most of those around him, including people who really liked and valued him, as a person who couldn't say no to Donald Trump, always wanted to encourage him, enable him, praise him. And so there was this incredibly awkward division and doublespeak in the White House, where a person would come, a senior advisor or cabinet member would come to Meadows and say, you know, this idea of the president's is really dangerous and you cannot let this happen. And Meadows would tell them, yes, I'm working on it. But when speaking with Donald Trump, he said, "Oh, yes, I understand, Mr. President. You're so right. You're so right, Mr. President." It kind of reminds me a little bit of the tapes, the Nixon tapes, where you hear Kissinger telling President Nixon that his speech that night was the best that has ever been given by any American president. "Oh, Mr. President, the best thing in the world."
Interesting. And who comes in second? I'm curious as to like the family. Where were they in this?
It's funny because what we learned in our reporting for I Alone Can Fix It is that, Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner were often sort of working behind the scenes. Jared more than Ivanka, especially on COVID and on the reelection effort. And they were making strides and almost tuning the president out to a certain degree. And when they became concerned that the president's strategy wasn't that great, they weren't exactly forceful in calling that out with him. It wasn't that they feared him, it's that they just didn't have huge confrontations with him, even when they worried that that path was a perilous one for the country, for public health, or a waste of time.
Interesting. Well, it is an impressive second follow-up. Like I say, I just can't believe, it's just, it just speaks volumes just that he was like, "Welcome back. You got my quote right. I'm a real stable genius. You guys," I just find that amazing. But Carol Leonnig, the Washington Post co-author, I should say, of Phillip Rucker, with I Alone Can Fix It, Donald J. Trump's Catastrophic Final Year. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today.
I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks so much, Sam and Emma.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.